Italy. And as I predicted, the bad boy Caravaggio has brought everyone out in droves. Now this is actually one of the things that one has to struggle against is I'm discovering as much with Van Gogh and trying to put together this exhibition. The biographical element tends to be the irresistible lure, and to try and distance yourself from it and actually look at the art, it's quite difficult sometimes, but I can tell you that our speaker will be able to do just that. Todd is someone that I've known for quite some time, more years than I care to say have passed since our graduate student days at Berkeley, but Todd actually teaches at Berkeley now, where he's been the professor of early modern art for quite some time, and he also earned his AD and his MA at Berkeley, so he's a real Berkeley boy. And I just wanted to note with admiration and sincere admiration the fact that he was able to disentangle himself from his then advisor Svetlana Alpers and her mind control and choose not to become more of a Renaissance specialist, because it's very difficult to study with her and not end up doing exactly what she does. He earned his PhD at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where he studied with Tom Crow and Patricia Simons, and is the recipient of many awards and academic honors, including multiple Mellon grants, the André Chastel Fellowship, the Hakan Postdoctoral Fellowship, and I could go on and on. I asked him for his resume yesterday, and I received a document that was more than 15 pages long. He is the author of Poussin, France, Painting Humanism and the Politics of Style, which was published by Yale back in 2002, and both of his books are in our store. The subject of his talk today is Caravaggio, and he did publish a book recently on Caravaggio called Caravaggio's Pitiful Relics, also published by Yale in 2014. He's published so many different essays in so many different academic periodicals that I don't need to list them for you. He has an incredibly impressive resume. But the other thing that I know about him is that he is a magnificent teacher. And his commitment to teaching, along with his commitment to original and groundbreaking scholarship, is something that we all admire. I should also note that he is working on a couple of new things, including a new book on Ribera, and he's also, that is actually on skin repetition and painting, which sounds intriguing. Maybe he'll tell us a little bit more about that. So just to remind you, the format that we're observing in this particular series is one that allows our speakers to really get into the weeds of their book projects in this case, projects that have consumed them for many, many years, which I think is always a wonderful way of taking advantage of their natural passion and the depth of their knowledge, which seems to come to them without thinking. And that's really the best type of lecture to hear. So, with that, thank you so much for joining me, and let's welcome Todd to the stage.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ike, and thank you, Michelle, for hospitality. As I want to respect the mission here in terms of teaching, it's difficult to really talk about something you've already published about, because you start getting into the niggly details of qualifications, and I'm going to try to avoid that. What I'd like to do is think about, just as a starting off piece, this painting that happens to be at this moment at the Getty as part of a restoration project of 3 paintings in the Borghese Gallery in Rome. And it's an important painting, not because it's this big, but it's a very modest, intimate work. In fact, the conditions of its production display are very much the elephant in the room for this talk, which is the portable easel painting, and specifically oil painting. This work was, as you might know, in the Villa Borghese, it was co-opted or appropriated from a major painter in Rome early in the 17th century, Cesare d'Arpino. Caravaggio worked for Cesare d'Arpino. He came from Milan. He brought with him fairly limited skills or constraints on his skills. He wasn't one of the painters for the big tent of St. Peter's in terms of fresco painting as a dominant medium. He wasn't trained by a father who taught him trade secrets. His training was mostly in Milan, with some training from Petrosano, a painter there. And importantly, he came to Rome and had this provisional moment in the workshop of Cesare Rapino, painting the flowers and fruits on the edges of frescoes. So it's that marginality of the painting practice. And as in this painting, this attention to still life as part of it. Now, so part of the importance of this painting is that this mobile easel painting that would gravitate toward various palazzi and villas in Rome in the formation of the 17th century collection. You can still see examples like the Doria Paldilli Palazzo, which has salon-style floor-to-ceiling paintings. So those conditions in which this mobile painting as part of a speculative production, a production that would gravitate toward dealers rather than patrons. And so that notion of the small-scale painting was also something that demonstrated, in this case, what Caravaggio was doing was demonstrating to his master at that moment what he could do. And what he could do was still life. In other words, his attention to the materiality and presence of objects is a knockout, as we know. And again, this painting in the Ambrosiana in Milan was a gift to the Duke of Tuscany. No, it was a gift to Cardinal. You don't need to know that, okay? It was a gift. Okay, that's my stress here, is it moved around and it was presented, and it was another kind of presentation piece of the kinds of qualities of intense interrogation of objects, of drawing inferences about the way we can understand what is on the obverse or reverse side of the basket by the development of the traces of the woven material, the incredible attention to differentiation of texture in terms of how we understand an apple from a grape from a leaf is based on our psychological and optical sensitivity to difference. And the other thing about these objects, such as these, and this is the kind of ground of his training. This is in Petrosano's studio, probably laying around on top of various drawings and materials, was a series of washes by Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci is not the Leonardo that we know from The Last Supper, or we know from these mechanical drawings, but rather his sensitivity to the use of wash as a primary means of describing the world. Now, wash as distinct from, importantly, design or drawing. And that's precisely what, on the one hand, Caravaggio was not trained as a draftsman. He did not have that deep, resonant, repetitious training in Raphael's studio or Michelangelo's studio. Didn't have that kind of internalized motor memory of the human body, and particularly the male nude life study. Instead, he has an attention to the surface qualities of the world. And in contradistinction to the emphasis in history painting, hierarchically superior painting, to volumetric sense of forms in a narrative space. He's very sensitive, as in this aspect of Leonardo, to the quality of light as it reflects differentially across objects. Now, in this detail, which I've always adored, this detail was a really pivotal moment. I'm thinking about this painting, is to think about, is not only the sense of the gestation and the sense of pods bursting and fruition that's demonstrated in Leonardo's, but rather these moments of desiccation, simultaneous desiccation, and the full life of a leaf. In other words, you have multiple stages of the life and death of a leaf. If you've noticed on Pinot vineyards, if you know grapes, Pinot in winter, there'll be this uneven pattern of desiccation and living, budding leaves. In other words, there's no clear pattern from life to death, but this overlapping narrative that takes place. And it's precisely, and I keep on stressing the word narrative, because narrative is usually associated with the high-blown, big tent history painting. But what I'm really particularly interested in is narrative embodied in objects. How change occurs and life processes occur in these intimate relationships to objects. And I think that's very important for understanding Caravaggio's development. But not only development, as I'll try to argue, is, what I'm going to try to argue is, how does a guy who can't draw, who does flowers and fruits on the edges of paintings, who creates a painting like this, which is a kind of grafted on, the Italians would say mezze figure, half figures. A half figure painting, a human body, but a human body occluded by this incredible bouquet, still life. And how awkward that shoulder is, how awkward he's kind of fudging, hiding. In other words, it really is this precious attention to face and to flowers and fruit. And so this is a struggle there. It's a demonstration of proficiency, but it's also a struggle that betrays the sense of an artist in the midst of trying to figure out how to work with the human figure. Because that's the priority. And that's how a marginal artist on the edges is going to get success in the market, and that market will escalate that artist into a patronage position, to seek and receive patronage. So it's this kind of painting that gravitates this artist. But it's, again, if I just say mezzo figure, if I say this as a kind of equation, what I'm missing is, in this moment in the painting, now it might seem to you as the pixelated image. It's not. Or it's pixelated, of course, but part of the uneasiness of this image is the way in which the figure lacks crisp resolution. There's a kind of diffusion of the edge. It's kind of it's part of a tension between having access to that individual and the reserve and quality of being removed. So there's already in this painting which asks, what is on offer? The boy or the fruit? It offers this anxiety, maybe that's too strong, pleasurable, it's a pleasurable anxiety about where we stand with respect to the figure. And where do we stand with respect to the art? Because the pleasure of the art is always has its darkness. So part of that pleasure is something like this Uffizi, another gift This one for the Duke of Tuscany, if you want to write that down. But another gift from Cardinal Del Monte, a patron of, who is very proud to show this work. And again, we're dealing with a very small, intimate painting that ends up in Florence. And portable, makes its way up. And importantly, when I keep on making that emphasis, we're really talking about an elite audience. But my emphasis is more on intimacy. In other words, conversation pieces, and conversation pieces, importantly, that do not have the label on the edge. There's no phone in a 17th century palazzo to listen to what you're supposed to be directed towards. There's no book by Todd Olson in the coffee shop, in the bookshop. You know, in other words, part of what you have to realize is you have to be on your mettle before these objects, because it's about the surprise. It's about the juxtaposition. This can be juxtaposed with ordinary. This can be juxtaposed with a full-blown history painting. And that's part of the game here. Part of the game is this dissociation of the object from its setting. And of course, that, you know, is the elephant in the room in a museum, right? We're constantly battling with providing sufficient support to understand the works. And at the same time, we want to maintain that sense of the surprise, the sense of discovery, but also importantly, the sense of being on one's mettle, right? And being transformed by the object, making that object transform us. And how does an object like this transform us? Well, again, we have the youth and the basket. We have the offering, and this is this is kind of a high-end youth with basket, right? Bacchus, we have just true to force, I mean, knockout sensitivity to, again, components of reflection and differentiation of glass, of translucency of materials, and then transparency that move back and forth, and then shadows that are responsive to the world. And that's key. Shadows, in this case, are not simply the light and dark, the chiaroscuro. Here's an object, and here is its cast shadow. We know that from the world. And once I use those words, it kind of cuts off the discussion. You know, on your little handout, when I put chiaroscuro tenebrism, what I fear is it cuts off the discussion, because suddenly we have these words, right? These words that limit our knowledge and value. I will know the famous dictum by Michael Baxendale, which is, language is a conspiracy against experience. Right? So this is my dilemma. You know, I'm conveying language but trying to open it up. So opening up that shadow is about the way shadows in the world, you look around you, shadows are vulnerable to ambient light, to ambient color. They're vulnerable to distinctions between opacity and translucence. They beckon us in terms of understanding an object in relationship to various surfaces and how it responds to different surfaces. So that's when I start using that language, you notice that it becomes a kind of primitive thinking. Primitive thinking in terms of the objects themselves are animate, the objects themselves are caressing each other, the objects themselves are yielding to our desire. So, as much as that boy is upstairs, the major part of the focus is on these kinds of surfaces. And again, what cuts off the conversation is if I were to put the word vanitas on the screen, right? We know that if you see a rotten fruit, it's a substitution for decay and perhaps death. It's an old tradition, right? It's emblematic, it's metaphoric, it's an abrupt exchange of one idea for an object. And yet, what I want to impress upon you is the ways in which the association of objects is the primary focus of this work. That even the human body is not contingent on our understanding of volume, but a human body is a surface like another surface. But another surface that in the folds of the white lead paint on canvas that's suggested by those materials, what we have is a kind of mimicry, repetition of the folds and caressing contact between skin and skin. Now we can call that, we won't call it that, but it can be called a metaphor, right? Kind of emptied out, that this is that, or, but what it is like drawing it's collapsing the human and the non-human, and collapsing the organic and the inorganic. It's more about that collapse that's intimate and luxurious and sexy. That sense of those surfaces can commingle. And it's a surface that at times, again, in this amazing still life on top of Bacchus's head. Now you notice I've held back from saying Bacchus, but Bacchus, of course, is this an extremely ambivalent figure. God of wine, but he's also the guy that went to India, created havoc, his followers decapitated tons of animals, sacrificed them, and it was part of the ambivalence in the pagan classical tradition is that Bacchus stirs up inner deep trouble. So surface beauty and danger. And so the reading of the desiccation and wilting leaves is one register of what is behind this life force is death. But at the same time, and I would prefer to not dwell on death here, but rather on the ways in which the lock of hair, these little locklets, imitate or commingle with the tendrils of the vine. In other words, there's this crossing, again, what is the word? We might say reference. And again, that doesn't capture what's going on materially with the painter. It's not a reference. I hate that when students now use that verb, referencing. That's why we're looking at this, okay? So we're not referencing, right? It's because referencing it implies that there's an equality between the objects, and they share and they get along together. They could go out for a drink or whatever. Where the reference is about a kind of equality of playing field. While objects like this, when an artist is digging deep, what we're digging at is our own vulnerability, even submission to the art, submission to life processes, the ways that the human and the non-human are maybe in conflict, but also maybe the human is subordinating itself to these other broader, larger processes. So one of the questions here is I've gone through a number of these developmental works, the 1590s, and some of them are quite accomplished because he got this reputation on his capacities to work with specifically the still life. And the surface texture of the human body, the likeness of the face, the half figure. And the half figure was deemed, it became a dirty word in this middle 17th century. The half figure was the death of painting because people were taking shortcuts. Caravaggio was to blame. Michelangelo's full-figured nudes, forget that. They're being truncated. And it was seen as part of a market mentality by the mid-17th century and created a lot of the biographical flack around Caravaggio precisely by his detractors who want to see him as the death of painting. But, so the question is, how does he, around 1600 to 1606, when he splits Rome, that short period of time, why does it become the major player in religious art in Rome? It's a mind-boggling. In other words, how do you reconcile that painting with that? That's it. I could apologize and give it. That's what I do in teaching is try to figure out the link, right? That's what I'm attempting to do. But I want us to dwell on that seemingly irreconcilable relationship between that deep pagan vision of a demonic world of Bacchus and full-out religious work, a work that was in the Chiesa Nuova, major church. First on your left, but again, the Chiesa Nuova is now in the it's now in the Vatican because Napoleon took it off the walls, brought it to Paris, and when we returned, it became art. It was no longer in the church. So here's this tremendous work, and we'll return to this the second lecture, thinking about it in relationship to an artist such as Rubens, who was working in this church and drew lessons upon it. So this is cutting edge contemporary art, circa 1600, 1604. So the question is how does he get there with these seemingly limited skills? Well, let's jump ahead. You might be disconcerted by the chronology a little bit. The chronology is always fudgeable because we don't know exactly why these works were produced. These two works were commissioned around 1601, so we're only a couple of years from the Bacchus, right? Bacchus is dated 56, 96, 97, so only a few years afterwards. And this is a major commission in a significant church in Rome. It's still there. If you make your Caravaggio itinerary, it's one of the major ones on the list. Let me explain that by looking at this. We're getting it's a chapel on the left, which is the prominent place and the most sacred place in the church in terms of a kind of honorable place, so the Charazi Chapel, a major, I forgot, no details. The point is here, you walk into that church on the left, and it's the Santa Maria del Popolo, the Saint Mary of the People on the Piazza del Popolo. The gates, it was the northern gate, all the pilgrims would go through that gate, and it's the immediate church you would hit on your left. So it's a very prominent public access church, great devotion, and part of that devotion is to, the patron wanted to devote to St. Peter on the left and St. Paul on the right, the two patron saints of Rome. In the middle, we have the altarpiece. So what we're looking at is, and this is important for Caravaggio, is in at least two major painting cycles, he's making lateral paintings, side paintings. So, how many of you have been to the Rena Chapel? Okay. What do you remember of the Arena Chapel? Okay, maybe that's, I'm not putting you on the spot. Okay, this is important. I mean, it could be, you could be thinking about that bad meal you had or whatever. It's fine. It's really fun. That's what pilgrims experience every day of their life. They had to go through 7 basilicae and that to get dispensation from purgatory, right? So 7 the same day. You can imagine how they can't remember a damn thing. So I'll speak from my own experience and from teaching. You go to jams and you go to everything, and they're always talking about Giotto's paintings on the walls, right? It's the lateral walls where all the action is. Nobody, except for specialists, nobody can remember what's on the altar, right? Because why is that? Okay, so this is a great orientation for any kind of Catholic space, which is altar, most orthodox. Altar is the place that's most conventional. Altar is where the Mass is said. Altar is where all the, as I say to my students, all the juju is, right? All the important, the presence of Jesus or Christ is there, right, during the Mass. Laterals is where is not that space. It's like the predella, on the bottom of the Maestà. It's the narrative space. So in the Arena Chapel, it's the story of Mary, her life, and the story of Jesus, his passion, but his integration into human life. So it's totally narrative-based, and as we know, all narratives have an arc, up and down. And then, in Jesus' case, it's upward again. But the upward again doesn't take place on the sidewalls, right? Upward again takes place in the altar. So the laterals is where you have the potential for not a consecrated space for the saying of the Mass, but rather fulfilling this obligation to tell the story and to adumbrate the story. Now, what we have in the center is Annibale Carracci. Annibale Carracci was commissioned by the patron to do the center and Caravaggio. So it was a friendly rivalry, way to the Italian notion of having some fun and upping the ante in terms of the production of the work. And so we know that Caravaggio and Annibale were aware of each other's art, and they respected each other. So it wasn't it didn't go bad, it didn't go sour. But Annibale is in this difficult position. Annibale has to represent the Assumption of the Virgin. Now, the Assumption of the Virgin is the mystery in which the body is miraculously elevated without the intermediary steps of death. Again, the dogma, is shaky. In other words, part of the representational problem is to show the mother of Jesus as dead and finished, kaput. So the issue here is how do you maintain the purity, and this is a time when she's conceived of as having no sin, immaculate conception. So it's really important for her body to disappear along with her son and be reunited in heaven. So there's a tremendous, and continues to be a tremendous emotional connection to that moment. And it's a moment which resides again on the purity of a woman. And we'll talk more about that next time. That in other words, a really symbolically fraught area in early modern cultures of whether a woman's good or bad. So this is the good woman, and this is again, Annibale he's incredible. He's a draftsman. He's from Bologna. He's responsible for the Farnese gallery and the fresco project. So he's competent in fresco. He's competent in drawing, and he's just lagging. I don't have to show you this, but he's just showboating Raphael, right? Because Raphael, this is 16th century construction, right? Michelangelo's divine, can't touch that guy. Raphael, the great compromiser, the great disseminator, the guy that can sustain culture. Michelangelo's a one-shot person. Raphael is the great cultural organizer. Giulio Romano, lots of studios, lots of drawing practice, lots of cartoons, and a lot of sensitivity to, the British in the 18th century adored Raphael. I don't know why, but they adored him for his Madonnas and children. But again, the point is, he's signaling a great compromise. This is a great artist who can work, importantly, he can do the frescoes, but he can also do something like small painting of a bean eater, or this really amazing Bacchus at the Capodimonte in Naples, that kind of gritty, fleshy in a hard opacity of the treatment of service. In other words, he can vacillate, and that's important here. His artists did not have, back in the day when people had slides, you were obligated to have 16 slides in your little pouch, and the primary criterion for acceptance or jobs or gallery representation was consistency, right? Consistency, and then in genre doesn't really matter that much. I mean, artists can kind of flap around different kinds of genres, but still life is a genre, portraiture is a genre. And genres have their own individual strengths and capacities. They demonstrate certain kinds of capacities, right? So Annibale could, he could paint anybody's socks off, but in this particular one, there's this great reservation. And a lot of it has to do with adjusting his style to the circumstances. It's from tu to vu. Formalizing the address, the decorum of the address, and that's key to genre here. It's formalized address. In high and religious painting, you have to follow a certain decorum. Now on the edges, we could even say the margins, which is in this narrative space, is where Caravaggio has this amplitude of possibilities. But there are possibilities that come straight out of that training with still life, right? Our material specificity, attention. And here we have the St. Peter on the left. And this is conventional. It's conventional. Michelangelo does it in the Vatican. That is the reversal of the crucifix. Peter didn't want to compare himself to Christ, so he opted to be hung upside down. And so in the process, what we have is a painting that denies the very verticality and symmetry of the centerpiece. It emphasizes, and again, we'll have to imagine, as we get in that little view, how oblique the view is onto it. And that oblique view has a pretty predominant derriere there, right? There's a sense of a discoordination, right, of what we're supposed to be looking at. Now, this is always the problem with martyrs. Martyrs are happy to go, and they're not that. It's difficult to make a martyr look interesting. Not because they're being, the torture stuff, yeah, but there's a discoordination, this discrepancy between the expression of the figure, because they're blessed and they want it, right? So they're bland. They tend to be bland, I'm afraid to say. And so a lot of the action that takes place and the demonstration of human expression takes place around them. And who's around them? Are the thugs, right? The executioners, the lowlife, the untouchables. Now the untouchables here, they're not the nice. They're not behaving like Gualiola's martyrdom of Saint Stefano. There's not this coordination, but rather almost as if you wanted to add this body to that body to that body, you get a complete body. There's a certain kind of, already in this piece, a kind of disaggregation of the parts, or then adding up. And part of it is this propensity we've seen in still life of occlusion, of making inferences about what we see when we can't actually see it. On the obverse side of a coin, we know what it looks like in our minds, but again, you have to always test your perceptions against what you know. What you know is three guys in a body, right? But what we see is, again, this disparity between wholeness of a body and that sense of the incomplete parts. But each part is part of a machine that's elevating that cross. And where's the cross anyway? I mean, when you start studying it, all you see is this beam, and then there's a confusion between the beam and the support, the lintel of the cross. What he wants to emphasize instead is a basic layout question of diagonal, of a lack of stability, and then the play of, and how his discomfort, and again the emphasis on the distressed skin, the pictorial signs of aging that in some hands would be just caricature, but here's this intense investigation of surface characteristics. And again, in our thug, in this guy, you can find in dozens of his paintings, there's a sense of what stands in for a life of experience in that compressed face. Again, the sense that a person is also an object, and an object that is susceptible, is subject to other objects. So that's St. Peter. On the other wall is the other patron saint of Rome, Paul. And Paul is an interesting character. Paul, and this guy is Saul. He's sometimes he's discussed as a Jewish collector of taxes, but he persecuted the Christians. That's his key here. And on one of his road trips, suddenly he's blinded by a vision, falls off his horse, and is struck dumb and blind. So if St. Peter is martyrdom, this is for 1600 circa, this is an important demonstration of conversion. This is a moment when the so-called Catholic Reformation, the Counter Reformation is important, that the Catholic Church, despite their huge losses in the 16th century, want to be convinced that they can still be the universal church. And they're going to do it by the process of conversion and through the promulgation of martyrdom at this time. So these are important themes for a pilgrim coming into the church, not erudite, elite, Bacchus, etc., but down and dirty Counter-Reformation mandate. But the mandate, the so-called mandate, is always, top-down culture. It's, you come up with, if you've ever had, art history 101, and they teach you the Counter-Reformation, they drag out the Council of Trent and tell you that art has to fulfill these mandates. The bishops got together and said, okay, here's the line on what art should do, because we're afraid of those Protestants who want to have those empty crosses in their churches. So the problem here is that top-down doesn't work. Right? You come up, you've been in those meetings, right? You come up with a nice outline, PowerPoint, and then actually executing it how do you do that? So what we're seeing here is a process of the kind of bottom-up kinds of skills that are required to discover what meaningful art would be. It's after the Reformation. Because it was threatened. I mean, people were whitewashing churches. They were destroying whole altar pieces. And then the art that was being produced is, the poor and evil is producing art that's kind of, say your Hail Marys and scoot out of the church. Here's an art that, again, is demanding certain kinds of recognition of experience outside the hierarchy. But what I want to stress, again, is it's not coming from some space of biography, but it's a space of studio. It's a space of learning to work with the tools of the studio and working from, again, I would stress that emphasis on material. Now, this is also not the vision, Peter, is a very interesting martyr because he seems responsive to that, his abjection. Paul, we're not even here at, importantly, this is not Paul. This is Saul. Saul's going to be there on the ground. He's going to be blind for 3 days. We're, 3 days of being Saul before he becomes Paul. 3 days, and it's always that miraculous 3. It's a magic 3. But it's not the miraculous 3 of being resurrection necessarily after 4. It's the moment in those 3 days when, they went in the Orthodox tradition, you shut down the church, right? You shut it down, you remove the stuff from the altars. There is nagging doubt that the resurrection will not take place. There's nagging doubt here. He doesn't know that he's in trouble. So it's this moment of stasis, right? Things may, not even stasis, it may be just, he doesn't know if it's stasis, which implies something's going to happen. He might just be stuck there. And so the violence of that moment, the violence is embodied in this topsy-turvy world of horses, hides, and grooms surmounting the wannabe saint. And there's almost a perverse echo of this gesture. And Mary up there. So again, you might, again, in my book, I put the full poem of Tom Gunn on this chapel. Tom Gunn was an amazing American poet. I have, again, a Berkeley connection. I happened to work with him as an undergraduate, one of my blessings. And in his account, he talks about, again, that the tension between the being reconciled with the world, and or reconciled with one's death in the Assumption, and the skepticism, or skepticism is a dangerous word, but a certain tension between what one has to go through in order to obtain salvation. It's that active component, the narrative component. And it has to do with confrontation with the world, substantive, the world of things, of topsy-turvy weight distribution. And for us as viewers, and this is the key, right, is that our expectations about resolved relationships and giving some kind of orientation to the object has been undercut. We're disoriented for the object, just as much as his disorientation. Should we be looking at this? It is an amazing, it's the most evocative passage of hide. It's like the Guercino, the Norton Simon, that portrait of a dog. You know, it's like that dogness or hoarseness of it. And moving through that, not being resolved to saying it's big horse and then end of story. So, again, the question arises, and I keep on thinking about this question, is how does this, where does this come from? You know, where does it come from the biography? Does it come from, I would say, the studio practice? But it's this, again, my emphasis is it's on working with certain constraints. That there's no genius factor here. I'm not trying to undercut, you know, maybe in my sleep I say genius Caravaggio, but and I maybe believe that, but I also believe that the achievement is through working under certain limits, constraints, and then taking those to another place, another context. What happens when you put a still life or an easel painting into the context of a chapel? And that's where this important relationship between collecting palazzi, that practice that's emerging in the 17th century throughout Europe, and the demands around 1600, the year of the Jubilee, the year that they consecrate the new St. Peter's. They finally tore down the old St. Peter's. They don't like to tell that, people don't like to tell that story, but it was a major shakeup and creation of a demand for imagery for chapels. So where does that come from? Well, and importantly, one of the things that I'd like to stress from the reference to Tom Gunn is his emphasis on this idea of the kind of lack of surety between found shadow, ambient shadow in the world, and the shadow in the picture. And that collapsing, and he uses a very strong word, which is doubt, pictorial doubt, and allowing a certain kind of religious doubt. Now, you can't say that, but it's totally heretical, right, to utter those words. But it is that in order to make salvation or conversion meaningful, there has to be the doubt. And that's a very modern sensibility, is you have to overcome that doubt or contend with that doubt or live, as many of us do, live with that doubt in order to understand how the picture is working. Questions or comments? I'm swinging it like a lecture mode. I want to give us some room afterwards, so just think about it. But if there's any interjections at this moment, clarification, I'm happy with that. Yep. Okay. And remember, if you come the second time, you can ruminate over some things, and it would be lovely to respond and think through it. Okay? So, let me go back a little bit, again, and just rehearse. I want to rehearse this idea that, and again, it's trying to reconcile certain pictures that you may know, may have seen. You may have seen this in the Louvre, when everybody is rushing. And you find that nice soft spot, and if you can, there's only a few soft spots. One's in front of the other Caravaggio painting there, the Death of the Virgin. We'll talk about that next time. And there's a lot of Italians around it. Italians go to the Louvre, look at Italian paintings, and look at Caravaggio. It's great. I love it. So this, again, it's a painting that is hostage to the Grand Gallery of the Louvre, and that's important. It's the sense that was a escape hatch for Louis XIII. It was not intended to be a place for small easel paintings, and so it's hostage to this situation which it never had occurred. But what they're connected is the ways in which this painting, again, is not arrested in a particular situation. People would be invited to go into the Palazzo of Cardinal de Monte and view the fortune teller, the so-called fortune teller, or Roma and the sidekick. So there's these half-figure paintings from the 1590s that are a development from that. And this is a place where we have, importantly, multiple figures. It's not a boy with a basket, or even a headshot with a basket. It's two figures in a social situation, and one that would have been recognizable through art, through opera. In the opera, Orfeo would have a little intermezzo with a Roma, or Zingara, or Gypsy, whoever you call that person, self-called Roma. That person would be dressed up, faux Roma, would be dressed up and sing the intermezzo. So we have a work that involves itself in the literature of the so-called Zingara, these landless, propertyless people who become a source of imagination and become the subject of the series, a kind of regular roll call of paintings of a fortune teller who may or may not be removing the ring of the Duke. I like to think that's ambiguous here, right? And other painters are more explicit. There's even a sidekick who's stealing money from his purse, and she's being robbed at the same time. Anyway, what's interesting about this is the subtlety of the elaboration. It's not caricature. And she certainly is pretty well to do for a streetwalker. And yet, this is precisely the area where a person like Valori is writing about this painting and saying, Caravaggio just pulled this gypsy out the street and painted her. It's a fiction, a construction, because this is again a world where Cardinal de Monte, in the privacy or the domestic setting, would invite people over and slum a bit, right? This is kind of an action slumming of the discrepancy between one's social position and the depicted person. A investment in recognition of social types, a recognition of street culture. And again, this is the whole culture of when there are tremendous anxieties about the social fabric, there's a greater attention to certain kinds of taxonomies, of visual recognition, of games even, card games about making the street cries of vendors. And that was a popular pastime well into the 19th century. So this is embedded, so street culture, as it were, is very safely secured within an area of elite recreation. Similarly, another knockout painting, this one in the Kimball Museum. What we get, and you think of this developmentally, the way I like to think of it, is here's an artist who's negotiating three figures at this time. Right? The three figures, half figures, table, some kind of reciprocal game. And of course, the game for us is to identify and taxonomize the vendor. This is like filled to the brim with certain kinds of observations about grifting, right? About card sharping, or cosenage, which we call the 16th century. Because it was a vast literature. One of the biggest promulgators of this kind of literature was Cardano, the father of statistics, Because you want to figure out, well, if you figure out cheating of cards, you may be able to figure out randomness and chance, right? Not fate, but so there's an intense preoccupation with cheating, and again, a kind of slumming. We've all known that the Grifters movies. the kind of the outsider's view on insider knowledge. And it's, to the brim. I mean, this guy, the coney catcher, he's called the coney catcher, he's doubling up. He's not only signaling, right, but he's also exposing the fact that he has cut his glove, which you don't do. Gloves are really precious objects, but he has decided to cut it in order to feel more cards. So, in other words, it's just packed with this kind of information, as it were. Let's go back to the whole painting. So, again, the painting, and again, the trick about talking about painting is moving between the narrative aspects, the figures, and then what kind of work is being done by the artist in terms of surface textures. In other words, there's plenty on view in this painting that's derived from his skills as a still life painter. And again, he can not, that just that feather is to die for in terms of this kind of compulsive attention to the differentiation and seemingly randomness of the effects there. And so, that's where I have on the sheet my Todd's axiom, which is, to paraphrase, is say, it's precisely these sites of social lower order that become the site for the investigation of these realistic effects. And I try to disavow the word realism because it truly affects and trying to figure out what are the effects, how are we convinced, how does randomness itself become a quality that's associated with our lives outside of structure, right? This unstructured life. So again, that's the coordination of the social hierarchy and realistic effects, but also importantly, the lower genre. Now, this kind of painting, it's very confusing because you talk about genre, and then there's so-called genre painting. I prefer to say low-life painting because it's more honest. So low-life painting becomes this site, particularly of the exercising these skills for the artist, and exercising the skills of the viewer in terms of a certain social currency, a certain knowledge, but also a passion, deep passion about those effects. Because poor Annibale is up there, showing off his Assumption of the Virgin, and there's no way we can attend to those surface qualities and effects in that work. Because those qualities are associated with lower decorum, but also they enter into this problematic area of the corruption or the entanglement of the Virgin Mary with our lived experience and all its ups and downs.
May I say something, please?
Please.
About that last slide that you had.
Yeah.
Your fabulous showing of these photos. Chris has demonstrated to me more than ever how effective his backgrounds are. For instance, you eliminate the white in this painting, it's not as effective. And I just, again and again, I see in these paintings that you've shown how effective he has handled the background.
Yes.
It's amazing.
Yes.
And how he draws your attention to people. One of the other ones showed, maybe it was the last one, showed the main subject had a dark hat and a dark robe, and there was light. The background right next to those areas was light, and your attention was just drawn immediately to that main character.
Great.
I've never noticed before how important the background is.
That's wonderful. And a part of it is that your description was based on your experience of the works, and if you look at certain kinds of shorthands for Caravaggio, You have people saying, oh, we suspect that there's a source of light from a certain direction, and therefore there must have been a studio with a window there. In other words, you go down this rabbit hole of reconstructing a lived experience, the artist in the studio, the real life, from the painting. But what you're describing is this complexity and responsiveness between figure and ground. And again, this is key. This is key for, again, I hate the word tenebrism, but we're going to be talking about these working with light as in certain counterintuitive ways. Working with it where it will not be doing the work that should be doing, that we're expected to see it. And part of that, again, is for someone who's attended to not beholden to the volumetric human figure active in the world, but beholden to surfaces, that's where light comes in really important in ways that aren't just about tonal gradation over a surface. Not that I don't love that in someone like Piero or Francesca, but it's a completely different strategy. Thank you. So, how to take that kind of world and transfer it to religious experience? And in this painting, I like to always, I'm always in this dilemma when I have handouts, because what I do if I was giving a series of lectures for students, I would put unknown, right? With no label, and in order to remind you that this painting that happens to be in the National Gallery of London right now was this kind of orphaned object in a collection. And that and the thing about an orphaned object, and all objects in collections are orphaned after all, we work for those references. But the clearest, most solid reference that one can bring to it is genre. Right? What does it remind you of? Well, we've been staring at this for a while, right? And that's what it should have, for the first viewers of that work around 1601, that's what they should have been reminded of. Because this was a high-end painting on the left, and multiple copies that were gifts among a certain elite, and then presented in a Mattei collection, this work. And it's like, oh, the point of this work is that it could be easily misconstrued or misrecognized. And that's important. Like students, again, you're beyond that, but students get really anxious when they don't know the answers, they don't know the story, and they don't. And that's good, because it opens up the room for trusting your responses to misrecognition. So the misrecognition here is, three guys sitting around a table. They happen to be eating, right? We know that it's not a domestic setting. There's a guy on the left who looks like he's some waiter or maybe the tavern owner. In other words, we're situated in a world of description of the everyday. Everyday, circa 1600. And that's part of the persuasive realistic effect. It's seemingly incidental, accidental, random, conversational. It has all those components, and it's tied to that. And that painting on the left is enabling you to look at this painting for what it is, right? It's extraordinary attention to seemingly scattershot attention. We don't know where to look. There's no where we should be looking, right? When we go there, we notice that even this hand-pressed, low-end ceramic ware is occluded by this arm, which is demonstrably set out and projecting, and it is attention to that moment. And this is, again, this is kind of like the punctum or the hallucinatory moment for me, and in a painting like this, and this is what I reconstruct in the first time I read about this piece, is that elbow. That elbow, you know, what do you do with that elbow? It's worn. In other words, it tells us a narrative of wearing out of the cloth, but it's also threaded, and the threads are coming undone. So it slips from close observation to notions of humility, poverty, and in fact, good poverty, right? The correct good, the good word. So it has this depth, even in a moment such as that. And that's it's not the movement per se, or the articulation of the human figure that's at bay, but rather this kind of thing. And so, again, the napkin in the lap of Othello is another, it's a tour de force in use of white lead to create the sense of form. But it also is a space where, and I always think of my grandmother, who would sit and fold and refold, and after she finally sat down at the table, and that nervous kind of repetition moment that's embedded in the object. In other words, there's no clear substitution of, again, the key here is a still life is a residue of social action, right? Or human presence. Forget social action. Just say still life residue of human presence. And tour de force, attention to textual differentiation. Is this the badge of a pilgrim? Is this a mark of St. James? Who cares? The question is asking you to kind of embed and be distracted from the envelope or the secure language. Shell. Shell is meaningless compared to the rendition of pain. And again, gristle. Should we be looking at the gristle of a roasted bird next to a bursting pomegranate, next to, in other words, here's this world of incredible visual distraction. So, we're back to the painting. Where should we be looking? Why shouldn't we be looking there? And it's hard when once you have the name of it or the topic, it kind of takes away the game of it. It's like the duck rabbit thing, and suddenly it's gone. But at this moment, what we're asked to imagine is the experience of these two guys on the left, who had been walking down the road, despondent. Much like Italy, there was you had to have companions on the road or you get robbed. So, but they had just lost their master, their Messiah, their rabbi. They had lost him. And they had no knowledge of the second part of the story, the resurrection. So they run into a guy on the road, and the guy says, "Can I join you for safety?" Yeah. They go to a tavern, they sit down, they eat, and then the guy does things that guys do. In his detail, is he grabs for the bread. He grabs for the bread, and bingo, he offers himself as Jesus. He suddenly becomes Jesus for a moment. So again, it's like Saul down there blind, right? It's about religious experience coming out of the, not out of that, coming out of, the accidental. That is an accident. I hope it's an accident. So it's this accidental quality of objects in the world that suddenly the religious comes in as a rupture in that world. Yeah, it's a lovely painting. It's in Ireland, Dublin, Dublin National Gallery, recently discovered in the last 10 years. There's a great, nice popular book about it. telling about how this painting was linked to the betrayal of Jesus. So there were pendants, and sometimes they come together in exhibitions. So here's Caravaggio at the top of his game in terms of a particular kind of devotional image, right? And one that fulfills the kind of requirements of he's found the story that completely is the way to show his great skills. It's around the same time that he gets his first major commission. The first major commission is in San Luigi Francesi, the French National Church, just down across the street from his collector Giustiniani, another collector Cardinal Monte, where he's sleeping. He goes across the street and he enters into this chapel on the left side of the church, and he paints lateral paintings. Okay, so center, I'm not going to really talk about the central, there's a lot of craziness around that centerpiece, but the important thing is that he initially paints this monumental work. And in that monumental work, again, we could do the recognition game, right? Recognition of certain skills, recognition of certain stock situations. It is, after all, in this chapel dedicated to St. Matthew, on the left is the conversion, or the calling. And the calling is introduced in the most subtle of ways, which is the hand out here, and there's a guy over here with a slight halo, and you realize that the figure that's blocked by probably St. Peter here, judging by his beard, and there's another figure over there. In other words, you have to extricate that gesture from this general area. And this is where the action is. The action is in the Matthew who's involved in money, collecting taxes, and in a profane world, suddenly being called upon out of that world to become an apostle. But it's the reserve here of skills from the fortune teller and this attention to the specificity of things that, again, there's a willingness to make things unintelligible, that confusing, compressed, overlapping. Now, with all this stuff that an artist can edit out, the palm tree coming out of your head in a photograph that you don't see until you've taken the photograph, right? That kind of observation, that's what artists do. It's like Photoshop, Photoshop the world so it confines itself to our experience and knowledge as seen in pictures. Right? But here's this world of the so-called realistic effects that I'm building on, which is again that kind of uneasiness of knowing what's going on, because that's another way the world works. The world works out of these momentary collisions of objects that seem to be a priori. There doesn't seem to be any kind of intervention on the artist's part. And there's where the biography of Caravaggio comes in, to kind of fill in that gap, to explain it, say, he is just painting as it is. Well, what I'd like to end with is the other painting in this. Now, again, the other painting in the chapel. You've already seen the Chirazi Chapel, right? The Chirazi Chapel, we've got on the left St. Peter, on the right St. Paul. We've got martyrdom and conversion. And again, we have in this painting, hot off the press, 1600 for the Jubilee year, droves of people coming into the French church, mostly French, but they would go straight there. It's like these early modern pilgrims, like people on buses, right? They just stick with their linguistic communities. Okay? We know that now. So you stick to your linguistic communities and you go to your national church, right? And Caravaggio's hooked up with, he was deep in the French in this world. So they would walk in on the left, see a scene that would be commensurate with experience on the road, a tavern type scene, or commensurate with the knowledge of painting such as that. And on the right, it's like, what the hell? I mean, what? We saw the martyrdom as the overturn and uplifting of the body on a cross, but to show a full-scale slaughter of Matthew. Matthew is at the altar. He's, as in back in the day, you would face the altar, and then he's knifed from behind. He falls over, and this is the coup de grace. So this is a painting in which the artist who had kind of was building up these capacities, largely on still life, has to face the music of full-scale bodies. Now, the question is, does an artist like that, who turns to a painting such as this, he struggles, right? This is underneath it. It's a mess. This is he completely overpaints it. In other words, he makes an initial painting, and it looks like, well, to clarify it, something like this. Bunch of thugs in the foreground, and where the hell is Matthew? Matthew is in there. So it's one initial thing is there's some kind of clarification, making it quotable, or acceptable, or legible. Now the problem with that is this betrays this painting. It's not a legible painting. It's not a painting that invites the clarification of form. And it's a painting that, again, you have to think about an artist who has to depict violent action in space and is accustomed to surface characteristics. What does he do? So I'll leave it with that. What the hell is he going to do? Okay, thank you very much.
Anybody want to pose a question? He gave you a lot to think about. You will come back next week with some event lessons. But thank you so much. I have a lot.
I was curious what the name of the book was on that supper of, you said on that discovery of that environment.
It's not a really flashy. I'll send it around if you don't mind. I can't recall it. It's nice because it's like Dennis Mahone, art historian, and we had 2 Italian researchers who do a lot of this groundwork. And the painting is discovered in a Jesuit sitting on the wall. But I'll send that over.
We'll see you next week. Thank you so much for coming.
just want to make sure that that one needs to be recorded. I don't know. Yeah. So I'm Marissa.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Here you go. Yeah.
So what time you starts at 5?
5:30.
5:30. I'll be here like 4:05.
Okay, cool.
And what are they using? PowerPoint?
Yeah. So he's gonna come around 4:30.